I had always been fascinated by lighthouses, their silent, towering figures standing against the relentless sea, casting their beams across the waters like guardians of some ancient, unknowable boundary. So, when I saw a job listing for a lighthouse keeper, I was ecstatic. I hadn't expected to find such a position, especially since most lighthouses are automated now, but this one was different. Isolated, with no connection to the mainland, located on a small, almost barren island far from any sign of civilization. It was perfect. The interview process was brief, conducted by a man who seemed more interested in my tolerance for solitude than in my qualifications. He asked if I could manage being cut off from all contact and, more curiously, if I was someone who could follow rules without question. The isolation, the dark, the sounds, you'll get used to those. He had told me with a tone that suggested he'd been there himself, but the seriousness in his eyes sharpened when he added, "But the rules are not negotiable. Disregarding them could lead to consequences beyond your understanding." I chuckled, thinking he was trying to test my nerves, but his unwavering stare silenced me. He handed me the rules, each line written in sharp, precise handwriting on a weathered piece of paper. Rule 1. The stairs must be free of dust and debris at all times. If the stairs are neglected, unseen forces will make their way up to you. Rule 2. As the clock strikes midnight, you must seal the door with a circle of salt to keep the revenant at bay. If you forget, it will enter and demand to share your body, seeking a host to relive its tragic fate. Rule 3. If the lighthouse lights begin to flicker uncontrollably, grab the lantern and stand in the center of the room. You must chant the keeper's oath, "I stand between the light and dark," until the flickering stops. If you don't do this, you risk seeing something you don't want to see. Rule 4. If the radio crackles with whispers, answer them truthfully. They may seem harmless, but lying will provoke something ancient to hunt you, turning your fears into reality. Rule 5. If you see a figure standing on the shore at night, do not wave or acknowledge it. It is a beacon for the lost, and engaging with it will bind your soul to the island forever. I read through the list, my initial excitement tempered by a creeping unease that settled in as I considered each rule carefully. Still, my curiosity and love for lighthouses were stronger than my fear, so I agreed, signed some paperwork, and was given a single night's shift to prove myself. Early that evening, I was ferried out to the island, and as the boat pulled away, I felt the profound emptiness of the place settle over me. The lighthouse stood tall, its white stone a stark contrast against the darkening sky, and the sea stretched endlessly in every direction, unbroken by any other landmass. It was beautiful but lonely, a singular beacon in a vast, indifferent expanse. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the keeper's room, taking note of each step. Dust was already beginning to gather near the edges, swirling slightly in the dim, yellowish light. I cleaned them carefully, remembering Rule 1 and feeling a strange prickling along my neck at the thought of unseen forces climbing the stairs if I neglected this task. My room was small, barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and an old, creaking wooden chair. On the desk sat a lantern, a thick ring of salt, and a radio with a crackling speaker that hummed softly with static. The air inside was heavy, filled with the scent of salt water and aged wood, mingled with something faintly metallic. I settled in, waiting for nightfall, the silence of the lighthouse only broken by the faint hum of the machinery and the rhythmic crashing of waves outside. First, everything was peaceful. The sea was calm. The beam of light sliced methodically through the darkness, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me. But as the hours passed, An undercurrent of tension began to seep in, a feeling that the walls were holding something back, something that waited just beyond the reach of the light. As midnight approached, I took the ring of salt and carefully poured it around the door, ensuring it was complete and unbroken. The act felt strangely ritualistic, almost sacred, and I was painfully aware of the absolute silence in that moment, the way it pressed against my ears as if something were listening, waiting. When the clock struck 12, the silence shattered, replaced by a coldness that swept through the room, a chill that seemed to carry whispers from the shadows. I stayed still, watching the door, half expecting it to burst open, but nothing happened. The salt circle held, and after a few tense minutes, the room returned to its prior calm. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, feeling both relieved and a little foolish for taking the rules so seriously. But just as I was about to sit back down, the radio crackled to life, the static intensifying, and through the distortion, I heard faint, murmuring voices. Rule 4 flashed through my mind, and I hesitated, my heart pounding as I strained to understand what the voices were saying. They were speaking in tones just above a whisper, fragments of phrases that made no sense, each word blending into the next. I forced myself to respond truthfully, though I wasn't sure what I was responding to. I spoke into the static, my own voice sounding foreign and shaky. The voices paused, as if listening, before dissolving back into static. I felt an odd sense of relief, but it was quickly shattered when, outside, I caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the shore, silhouetted against the faint glow of moonlight. They were completely still, unmoving, their form dark and indistinct. I gripped the windowsill, my instinct to wave or shout overriding the sense of dread crawling up my spine. But I remembered Rule 5 just in time and backed away, averting my gaze, resisting the inexplicable urge to acknowledge the figure. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, a heavy, oppressive weight that filled the room as if the walls themselves were leaning in to bear witness. The lighthouse light began to flicker suddenly, the beams stuttering as shadows danced across the room. The flickering became frantic, almost panicked, and I remembered Rule 3. I grabbed the lantern, positioned myself in the center of the room, and with a trembling voice, began to chant, "I stand between the light and dark." The words felt strange on my tongue, like an invocation, each syllable carrying an unfamiliar weight. The light continued to flicker, casting distorted shapes along the walls, shapes that twisted and elongated, almost forming figures before dissolving back into shadow. I repeated the chant, louder this time, my voice echoing slightly as if the walls were amplifying the sound, until finally, the flickering stopped. I stood in silence, my heart racing, the room now still but filled with an uneasy tension, as if something had been waiting just out of sight, ready to emerge at the slightest misstep. Exhausted but alert, I checked the stairs once more, ensuring they were clear of any dust or debris, each step feeling heavier than the last as I climbed back up. The hours stretched on, and the isolation felt more oppressive, the silence now tinged with a sense of anticipation, as though the lighthouse itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sea outside had grown restless, the waves crashing harder against the rocks, filling the air with the scent of salt and something darker, something like decay. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on my duties, but the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, persisted. I glanced out the window, catching sight of the figure still standing on the shore, unmoving, its gaze, if it had one, fixed on the lighthouse as though waiting for a sign, a signal, something to acknowledge its presence. The minutes crawled by, each second filled with an increasing sense of dread, as if the very air were thickening with unseen presences. The radio crackled again, the voices returning, louder this time, their whispers more insistent, pressing against my mind with a force that made my head ache. My fingers trembled as the voices from the radio grew louder, no longer a distant murmur but a chorus of frantic whispers, each one pressing into my mind like cold fingers clawing at my thoughts. The words twisted together, some in languages I couldn't recognize, others in English but distorted, voices speaking over one another in a desperate, pleading tone that filled the room, surrounding me, making the walls seem to close in. I tried to answer them truthfully as the rules demanded, my voice barely a whisper as I spoke into the static, my own words feeling feeble against the relentless voices that swarmed from the radio. But something was different this time. The voices grew angry, their pleas turning to accusations, and I felt an unnatural pressure building, as if I'd offended whatever presence lingered within the static. A shadow flickered just at the edge of my vision, a form shifting along the wall, stretching unnaturally, its limbs elongated and moving in jerks and spasms like something forced into a shape it didn't belong to. I spun to face it, my heart hammering in my chest, but the shadow darted out of sight, leaving only the cold, prickling sensation that crawled along my spine. Just then, the light flickered wildly, plunging the room into darkness and snapping back on in chaotic bursts, and I fumbled for the lantern, remembering Rule 3, the words of the Keeper's Oath echoing in my mind as I stumbled to the center of the room. "I stand between the light and dark," I whispered, then louder, my voice shaky as I repeated it, feeling the air grow thick around me, oppressive and filled with the heavy, rancid stench of seaweed and rot. The light flashed, illuminating the room for a split second, just long enough to reveal a figure standing by the doorway, tall with hollow, empty eyes that bore into me, its mouth stretched wide as if caught mid-scream, yet no sound escaped. I froze, my voice faltering, but I forced myself to continue chanting, my words barely holding back the terror that clawed at my throat as the figure swayed closer, moving like a reflection in broken glass, its image shuddering and distorting with each flicker of the light. "I stand between the light and dark," I forced out, feeling the figure pause, its empty gaze locked on me, before dissolving into the shadows as the light finally steadied, leaving the room silent but weighted with the feeling of something unseen, lurking just beyond sight. I sagged in relief, but the moment was shattered as the radio sprang back to life, louder and more forceful, the voices turning guttural and hostile, accusing me of intrusions I hadn't made, of crimes I didn't understand. I backed away, my head pounding, the sense of being watched tightening around me like a noose, until my eyes landed on the window. I knew I shouldn't look, but something compelled me, some invisible force pulling my gaze to the shore where the figure stood. No longer alone but joined by several others, all standing shoulder to shoulder, their blank eyes glowing faintly in the night, each one staring up at the lighthouse, at me, as if waiting, expectant. My breath caught and I tried to look away, but my gaze was drawn to the faint light reflecting in their eyes, a gleam that pulsed in time with my own heartbeat, faster and faster until I could feel it pounding in my ears, a cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. I stumbled backward, tearing my gaze away, only to be met with the sight of the door creaking open, the salt circle around it scattered, disturbed, as a cold wind swept through, bringing with it the faint sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, climbing the stairs. The rules flashed through my mind, a panic jumble, but it was Rule 2 that struck me, the rule about the revenant seeking a host, and I realized with a sickening dread that midnight had passed and I hadn't reinforced the salt. The footsteps grew louder, each step an agonizing, dragging sound as they approached, and I could almost feel the weight of its presence pressing against the walls. A sorrowful, relentless force that filled the air with an ache, a heaviness that seeped into my bones, urging me to surrender, to let it in. I tried to move, to rebuild the salt circle, but my limbs felt heavy, as if weighed down by the same despair that pulsed from the creature on the stairs. The room grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me, each exhale catching in the frigid air as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a pause, a silence that stretched on, every nerve in my body screaming as I waited, paralyzed with fear. My gaze fixed on the doorway as the shadow shifted, and then, slowly, a face appeared. A pale, hollow face with eyes that held centuries of suffering, its mouth stretching into a terrible, mournful smile as it reached out. One skeletal hand grasping the edge of the doorway, fingers curling with a sickening, bone-cracking sound. The air grew thick as I stared at the skeletal hand gripping the doorway. The fingertips rotted, tendons exposed, stretched taut and glistening as if clinging to a life long lost. It seemed almost too real, too tangible, as if death itself had taken form to reach for me. The figure's hollow eyes met mine, and I was overwhelmed by a sorrow so intense it felt as if it were my own, as if I too had suffered 1,000 lifetimes and could bear no more. My body locked in place, bound by an unnatural paralysis that held me against my will, forcing me to confront this figure that, according to the rules, would not simply haunt me but would claim me, consume me if I allowed it to enter. It was then that I felt the cold seeping in through the walls, creeping like fingers across my skin, leaving every hair on my body standing on end. The cold felt alive, intentional, a malicious presence that searched for any weakness. My mind screamed at me to move, to reseal the door with salt, to do anything to stop the revenant's advance. But my limbs were unresponsive, weighed down by the invisible grip of despair that seeped from the creature's stare. Its other hand emerged from the shadows, gripping the doorway with claw-like nails that scraped along the wood, sending a sound through the room that was sharp and hollow, as if it had scraped through the last remnants of my sanity. My eyes were fixed on it, my heart pounding against my chest like a trapped animal, as the creature tilted its head, its mouth stretching wider, a terrible, cavernous grin that spoke of depths I could barely comprehend. An endless hunger, an agony that had rotted away any humanity it once possessed. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to speak, to utter some plea, some incantation that might drive it back, but the words failed me. The presence in the room grew stronger, pressing down on me, filling my mind with visions of death and darkness, with the echo of screams trapped within that hollow grin. It stepped forward, its footfall barely a whisper, a mere brushing of sound, yet it was enough to send waves of terror rippling through me. The radio crackled to life again, no longer whispers but screams, a cacophony of tortured voices, some shrieking, others pleading, calling out my name in a twisted mockery, as if I too had become part of the endless suffering that permeated this place. I could feel its gaze penetrating my very soul, as if unraveling me piece by piece, and with every second I could sense it drawing closer, its presence growing stronger, feeding on my fear, twisting it into something tangible, something alive. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, my fingers digging into the rough wood as I fought for control, struggling to breathe against the weight pressing down on my chest, against the smell of decay that filled the air. A stench so foul it burned my throat, clung to my skin, sinking into every pore. The flickering light cast shadows that danced across the walls, elongated, distorted, as if mocking my helplessness. each shadow stretching toward me like claws, reaching to pull me into their cold, unfeeling embrace. In my mind, fragments of the rules spun wildly, but I couldn't grasp them, couldn't think clearly enough to remember what I was supposed to do to survive. I tried to crawl toward the door, desperate to rebuild the salt circle, to do anything to protect myself, but the cold intensified, sinking deeper into my bones, turning my movements slow and clumsy, like I was dragging myself through icy sludge. The revenant took another step, its hollow eyes now glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Each beat a countdown to some inevitable, horrific fate. It leaned closer, its face inches from mine, and I could feel the chill of its breath, a frigid mist that coiled around my face, tightening until I felt I might suffocate. My vision blurred, and in that instant, I saw glimpses of the figure's past, flashes of a life filled with betrayal, pain, and horror. Each memory an echo of the suffering it carried with it, an endless cycle of despair that had twisted it into this monstrous form. I felt my own mind slipping, consumed by its despair, by the darkness it dragged with it, an endless void that threatened to pull me under, to erase me completely. My voice cracked as I managed to whisper. I stand between the light and dark, clinging to the words like a lifeline, forcing them out even as my throat burned, even as the creature's gaze bore into me, hungry, ravenous. The words felt hollow, weak, but I repeated them again, louder, forcing myself to push past the terror, to stand between the light and dark, even as the revenant's mouth opened wider, revealing rows of broken, jagged teeth, its grin stretching beyond the limits of human anatomy. It paused, cocking its head as if considering me, and I could sense its curiosity, its amusement, as if my defiance was some pathetic game it was enjoying. The voices on the radio grew frantic, each one screaming louder, urging me to run, to fight, to survive, but I knew I couldn't leave. Even if I tried to escape, there was nowhere to go, nowhere on this forsaken island that would be safe from the creature that had already claimed it as its own. The walls seemed to pulse, darkening, closing in as shadows gathered around us, wrapping me in their cold embrace, and I realized that it was not just a creature I faced but the island itself, a place filled with echoes of those who had come before me and had never left. As the shadows closed in, I could feel the weight of the revenant's gaze fixed upon me, an unbearable pressure that gnawed at my mind, as though it sought to peel away my memories, my very sense of self, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a man. I was certain my body would give in, that I would be pulled into the endless suffering that had claimed so many before me, when suddenly my fingers brushed against the salt pouch lying abandoned on the floor. The circle had been broken, my last line of defense shattered by my own terror, but in that instant, a surge of clarity pierced the fog clouding my mind. I dug my nails into the pouch, feeling the rough grains of salt against my skin as I forced myself to sit up, every movement labored, as if fighting against invisible chains that held me in place. I began to scatter the salt around me in a trembling circle, every grain catching the faint glimmer of the light as the revenant loomed closer, its hollow eyes flickering with a twisted hunger. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to repeat the keeper's oath, clinging to the words as I laid the final line of salt. I stand between the light and dark, over and over, louder each time, until it wasn't just a chant but a desperate plea. The revenant stopped, its gnarled hand hovering inches from my face. A cold so intense it felt like my skin was burning, freezing me to the core. Its empty, pitiless eyes bored into me, and I could feel the full weight of its agony. The the centuries of pain it carried, as though it was inviting me to take its suffering into myself. For a moment, I nearly surrendered, drawn to its despair, the twisted, silent promise of an end to fear, to loneliness, to all human pain. But in that moment, something within me rebelled, a surge of life pushing against the dark as I screamed the Keeper's oath with all the strength I could muster. I stand between the light and dark. My words rang out, shattering the silence like a knife slicing through shadow, and the revenant staggered back, its expression twisted with rage, its mouth open in a silent scream as the salt circle glowed faintly, a barrier between me and the horror that had nearly claimed me. The lighthouse light above us flared brighter than ever, illuminating the room with a blinding radiance that cut through the shadows, dissolving them, forcing the revenant back as it shrank from the light, its form flickering, losing shape as it twisted and writhed in agony. I watched, breathless, as it backed toward the doorway, its hollow gaze locked onto mine, promising that it would return, that it would haunt me until the end of my days. But as it faded into the darkness, the room grew still, the chill retreating as warmth slowly seeped back into my bones. The radio went silent, the voices dissipating into empty static, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping, drenched in cold sweat but alive, my heart pounding with a desperate, trembling relief. Outside, dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the mist, casting the room in a soft, golden light that felt like salvation itself. I knew I wouldn't stay another day at this place. There was nothing in the world that could make work at the lighthouse again, even for a damn minute. I had survived the night that the revenant was gone, for now at least, but the island's silence held a haunting memory of the creature's hollow eyes and its cold, ravenous gaze. As I stumbled outside to wait for the boat, the salt pouch still clenched in my hand, I glanced back at the lighthouse one last time, knowing that some part of me would always feel its darkness lingering, its presence waiting, as if it were merely biding its time, watching and whispering from the shadows, ready to reclaim what I had so narrowly escaped.